Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we're going to hear about, Muriel Matters, 1877 to 1969, and we're going to hear from Helen Pringle. So thank you so much, Helen.
Okay. Thanks so much again for having me. It's always wonderful, and I really look forward to speaking into the questions and just knowing that there are other people around the world who are kind of interested in the same things that I am. And uh, the other thing that I'd just like to begin by saying is that I am um, uh, speaking and working on Indigenous land in Australia, which was never ceded and to the white conquerors. And I'm usually speaking from Aora country in Sydney, but I'm on a little short holiday in Brisbane, and I'm speaking from an area which is slightly north of Brisbane in Australia. It's very rich in Indigenous mythology and it's very beautiful as well. So it's all in all a lovely opportunity, and thank you. When I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about who Muriel Matters was, because she might be unfamiliar to some people, or many people. I'm not sure how many people have heard of her, know what she did, what she thought, what her life was. I'm first of all going to be talking about her daring feats. Sometimes they were derogatorily called stunts, even by people who are relatively sympathetic to her. But these feats, I think, they give a sense of who she is and of the context against which I'll talk more at the end about one particular idea that she has about demilitarization. But I wanted to give you a sense of the spirit in which she writes, the spirit in which she led her life. She was imaginative, she was creative, and she was incredibly courageous. She's renowned for some actions that were spectacular, which I'm going to start with, but she was a lot more also than just these spectacular feats or stunts, and I'll end with that. Muriel, and I'll call her Muriel, she was otherwise known as Miss Matters, and I think it's a lovely name to have. When there's two books that have been fairly recently published on Muriel, and they both have in the title Muriel Matters. And Muriel does matter, I think, and that's what I'd like to talk about, why she matters to us and why her friends, the suffragettes, matter to us and what we can learn from them. Muriel was born in Adelaide in 1877 in the state of South Australia. So that's down the bottom of Australia. If you can see this picture on the first slide, it's a picture of Muriel, and you might wonder what is she doing or what's happening in the picture, but it's a picture of Muriel about to give a speech to the House of Commons. She was renowned as the first woman to speak from the floor of the House of Commons, and I'll explain how that came about. I love this picture so much, and the grill that she was chained to when she gave the speech, and I'll explain why she was chained to the grill. She chained herself to the grill, rather. The grill, or part of the grill, one part of the grill in the House of Commons, is now on display in the South Australian Parliament House, and my signature picture at university and in other places on social media is me standing next to the grill, a picture taken beautifully by Simone Andrea, who some of you might know as well. Muriel was born in Adelaide, and she began her career. She was one of a very big family of 10 or 11 children, and she was dedicated her early career to acting and to elocution. Elocution is not something that people generally do these days as a career, but in Australia you would often send your children. I was sent for elocution lessons, for example, when I was little, even then, but not so much. I don't think it's in vogue anymore. But certainly in Muriel's time, you would send men and women and children to an elocution teacher who would teach them how to speak properly, which was in that time generally how to speak like an English person, and to speak, to be able to give public speaking as well. And so one of the things that Muriel did, and this was much remarked upon by her friends in the suffragette movement, was she was a very clear and dramatic speaker who was able to speak, in the way that opera singers sing, so that you can hear them without a microphone from in a big opera house. I haven't mastered that art yet, but and she. It would often be that you would give shows, demonstrations of elocution, or, for example, you might be invited to ceremonies of parties or openings and things like that, and then you would give a reading of a poem, for example, a poem or a story, and that would be a piece of entertainment in itself. Muriel went to journeyed in this sort of a rather long-lasting tradition that young Australians have of going to what was then known in 1906 and still known by some, what I would call arse-lickers, if I could be so bold, is still known by some people in Australia as the motherland, in other words, or as the homeland of Australia. We still, in Australia, have a flag which has a Union Jack, the flag of England, the flag of the United Kingdom, rather, in the corner of it. We're not a republic. When she went to London, she said she provides a little herself, a little biography of herself going to London and talking about her initial impressions, which were not very complimentary of England. She found it very grey and dark. In other words, lots of rain, I think, but also she was struck by the contrast between poverty and great wealth. One of the first people that she met was the anarchist Peter Kropotkin, Prince Kropotkin, and he pushed her out of elocution and a career in acting into a political career. But the seeds were already there when she went. She said she was already a socialist when she went, and I don't think she ever called herself, ever sort of said, I am not a socialist, or I have become so, I'm not a socialist, or anything like that. I think she was a socialist throughout her life. Some of that will come out in what I'm going to be talking at the end, but there's a lot more as well about her activities and her beliefs. She also made friends with W.T. Stead, who was associated with the International Abolitionist Movement. I've not been able to find any evidence that she was directly involved in the anti-prostitution, in the movement against the prostitution system, but I'm still looking and I'm hopeful of finding things. Surprisingly, when she came to, by 1907, she said she had joined the suffragettes. And sometimes people and I think it's a very common thing, I didn't know this before I began looking more closely and reading more about the suffragettes, but the Women's Social and Political Union, which was the dominant organisation, I suppose, and the most well-known organisation of women's suffragettes, identified with the Pankhurst family, the women of the Pankhurst family in particular, and the WSPU, they had embarked by that time upon a certain political program, and that political program was dedicated towards votes for women, but not to be forgotten was they called for votes for women and chastity for men. So they were, in fact, very explicitly against the global prostitution system, against the prostitution system. Another organisation, and it was one that my great-grandmother belonged to, was the Women's Freedom League. A leading light of that was Charlotte Despard, and that was the organisation that Muriel Matters joined when she went to England. Probably her first, and I'm going to return to that distinction between the two organisations. I just saw somebody talk about Muriel's wedding, and always Muriel is a name that I think is identified with in Australia with and in other places with that film. But going back to Muriel Matters, one of her first actions, and I don't know how she financed this. One of her first actions was And the next slide shows a picture of the caravan that she drove around in, and she was the driver for the most part. Oh, I'm sorry, that's Muriel reading a book, and then the next one is the caravan. It's widely thought that it was widely said that there was a caravan that she drove. I actually think there was more than one, because I've found pictures where they sort of look a little bit similar, but they have different features and different writings on them and so forth. The campaign consisted of Muriel going around parts of England and Wales in particular, driving, as I said, driving the caravan herself, which must have been quite a sight, I think, to people unused to women driving, or even being mobile in that way, being something other than passengers. And you can see on the side of that caravan, Women's Freedom League and Votes for Women. And what Muriel did was just to drive around England and Wales in particular, and spread leaflets and talk to people and just campaign for women's votes. Again, I don't know how she financed this, or who financed it, or whether it was but it was a Muriel initiative, if you like, for the Women's Freedom League. In the next slide, you can see the, hi Sophia. You can see Muriel, and that's a typical pose for Muriel. You can see the joy on her face in doing this, that it wasn't just a chore that she did. And Muriel was always a terribly, I don't want to say that she took things lightly, or that she thought this was fun or anything like that, but she always campaigned in her life and in her writings and in what she said, her talks, etc. She always campaigned with a great deal of joy, and I get the sense of real sisterly. There's always mostly pictures that you see of Muriel, and she's usually with other women. It's not just, here is Muriel Matters, the great suffragette. She was a suffragette amongst suffragettes, and she took great delight in that. And that sense of friendliness, of comradeship, I think, and of courage, I think is so important in her sense of herself, and in what she really comes through in what she wrote as well. And I think there's one more caravan shot, maybe, or this, or it can, oh, sorry. And then this, if I could just go back a little bit forward, sorry. There, and then there. This was and you can see this on Joe's flyer for this talk. This was another effort of Muriel in 1909. In 1909, Parliament was sitting and had begun to sit, and the King, Edward VII at the time, he had was taking the route to the House of Commons. And you know how, I think you probably know how these things go. I find this most amusing. But the King will go in his car, and the Crown will follow in its own car behind. And so you have the King and followed by his Crown. With the Crown usually has its own sofa. Anyway, Muriel decided that this was the best good opportunity as any to launch a Votes for Women airship. Again, I have no idea how this was financed. I don't think it could have been cheap. And she launched the Votes for Women, and this airship was meant to fly over the King's procession along Whitehall towards the Parliament, and the procession to the Houses of Parliament, and she would drop leaflets from it. Unfortunately, the winds were pretty strong in London that day, and so it was blown a bit off course, and so it didn't actually cover the King's convoy with leaflets, but it covered other sort of more outer suburbs of London with leaflets in that way. And if you go back to just the slide before that, this is Muriel waiting to go up in the balloon. I don't. There's a look of joy and delight and courage on her face, but I don't think I could have summoned up that look on my face myself. I would have been scared out of my brain anyway. And it was for many people a fun flight at that time, but for Muriel it was much more than that. The thing that Muriel was most famous for, though, was something that happened in October 1908, and which is you'll see on the next slide. By 1908, women were campaigning full scale for the vote. And the only place that they were allowed to stand in Parliament or to sit in Parliament or to speak softly in Parliament was behind, and you can see the picture up the top, there's the grills, and there's a series of them. There's three, block of three, block of three, block of three. And women sat behind those grills like as if they were in the Sultan's harem, and not to speak, but just to view. That was the only way that they could view Parliament, the sitting of Parliament and what Parliament did. All of that other area in that photo is occupied by men and was occupied by men. What Muriel did, and a number of her friends did, was to chain themselves to the grill up the top. I'm sort of pointing it as if you can see me pointing, but see what I'm pointing to. But they chained themselves to the grill, and they chained themselves so effectively that when the Sergeant-at-Arms and his helpers came along to remove them from the grill because they were speaking and making a lot of noise from the grill, there was no way that they could. They weren't able to unlock the handcuffs that the women had used to chain themselves to the grill, because they didn't have the keys, and the women wouldn't give them the keys, and they couldn't cut through the handcuffs that the women had used, the chains that the women had used, and so they had to remove the grill itself. And you can see that, I think, on the next slide, which is taken from the first part. There. So on the left, this is a drawing of Muriel being removed from Parliament, chained to the grill, and the other women with her also chained to the grill. They had to take the grill downstairs and get professional kind of grinding to get that off, and Muriel was escorted away. As she was being removed, Muriel had the absolute calmness to say, she said, "We have sat behind this grill for too long. It's time that the women of England were given a voice in legislation which affects them as much as it affects men. We demand the vote." Security staff swarmed around her, as you can see, and Muriel just continued on. She said, "We have listened to the illogical utterances of men too long. Look at this government calling itself a liberal government and showing itself illiberal to the women of England. Why don't you attend to the women? We protest against the inaction of the government. Please stop that nonsense and attend to the women." Women are very dangerous, Winifred, that's true. But what we need to do is attend to the women, to listen to the women, to pay attention, to speak to them as equals, I think is all done in there. She was released, strangely enough, and the other women with her were released without charge, I think probably because they just couldn't think of a charge at the time. There was no precedent for people fastening themselves to the grill. But as they were let out, they went to another demonstration nearby, another demonstration of suffragettes, and they were charged with willful obstruction of the street. The next day, on the 29th of October 1908, they were sentenced in Westminster Police Court. They were asked to pay a fine. I think the fine was £5. They pay a fine or make a solemn oath that they would never do this again. Of course, none of them did that. That was entirely against their principles and their practices, and they were all sentenced to 1 month in Holloway Prison. In the next couple of slides, you can see Muriel in prison garb. So she was led away. And she is as a suffragette, and on the left you can see her medals, the medals that were awarded to women by organisations of women to acknowledge that they had been to prison and that they had suffered this terrible punishment and were often. I'm not sure whether Muriel was force-fed, but force-feeding was a common tactic by the government to require suffragettes to toe the line. I think there's just one more slide which shows her Muriel in her prison prison stuff. No, sorry. I'll get to that other one in a second. So Muriel then was, after she left prison, after she got out of prison, she spent more of her time in the caravan. She never went up in the airship again, as far as I know, but she spent more time making addresses throughout England and Wales, and she also travelled to Ireland and gave a talk, for example, to a meeting arranged by the Lord Chief Justice in Dublin, made a talk to them about the importance of women's voting. I don't want to give the impression that, and I know, again, to reiterate what I said before, too often suffragettes are characterised as not very radical. They wouldn't fit in a radical feminist meeting like ours. I think this is quite false. Although they campaigned on the slogan of votes for women, never forget the other part, which is chastity for men, which was directed against the trade in women's bodies and lives. Muriel also, but they were also involved in, lots of other kinds of activity. For example, Muriel denounced sweat labour. She advocated that women have unions. She advocated and supported equal divorce laws, equal pay for equal work, that motherhood should be supported and given an endowment, and she also campaigned for support for unmarried mothers as well. With Vida Goldstein, who was another Australian feminist who probably hasn't been also, is probably a bit better known than Muriel Matters, but I don't think has even received half the attention. We haven't attended to Vida Goldstein in the way that we should have. Muriel worked with Vida Goldstein to secure a resolution from the Australian Senate to the British Prime Minister, telling the Prime Minister in Britain about the good results from the enfranchisement, from the giving the vote to Australian women. This is often represented in terms of a picture of England as the mother country, and Australia as the girl, and the girl is saying to her mother, saying to the government, listen to the women as they have in Australia, attend to the women as well. I think it's a really lovely word, to attend to, because it's so rich in the different meanings that it has, to not just to listen, but to really listen and to take up what's happening as well. Pay attention to them in every way possible. In London in 1911, Muriel also helped to form a women's settlement to further educational opportunities in the poorer parts of Lambeth where she lived. And just to finish off here, in 1911, on the next slide, you'll see Muriel's census return. Again, this is something that I think is getting better known, but not always as well known as it should be. As in 1911, the census of England, Wales, and Scotland. The suffragettes held a campaign against the taking of the census, and they would do lots of different things. Some of the women just ran off to skating rinks and had parties, suffrage parties, and refused to sign the census form. Muriel's form is a typical response here, that she writes here, no votes, no census. And she says, as I am not, as you do not treat me as a person in terms of politics, in terms of having a vote, then I don't count as a person. I am not a person for the purposes of this census. And she signed it down the bottom. A lot of people took different ways of manifesting their response to the census, but it was an important political tactic at the time, and was very strongly attacked by people who thought this was not a legitimate way for women to bring their argument to the fore. And the last little slide there before I go on to here, skating parties, which is the next one here. There. This is, and just to skip to the end of Muriel's life, Muriel never recanted from her views or never stopped campaigning for her views. In 1924, she stood as the Labor candidate in the seat of Hastings. She didn't win, but one of the things that I was just thinking about was also that, again, sometimes people might say, well, she wasn't one of the most radical. Nevertheless, I think it's a little bit in some ways a little bit unfair to say that, because often we don't necessarily know what people were doing or who they were associated with, what they and some of the evidence that we have is lacking. But also, don't always remember that Muriel never was sectarian in her suffragettism, if I can say that, her suffragettism, that she always believed that women, the differences between women were not crippling, that they didn't mean that we couldn't work together. And so that for her, it was always important to work across boundaries and to work with other women. That was the main thing, rather than to ask them first, well, are you as radical as I am, or less radical, and so forth, and to establish that. I know it's a difficult question to talk about collaboration and working together, but I just wanted to note that her ties with people were sometimes not as well known as those of others, and also she never was separatist from other suffragettes. This is, however, I think, as somebody remarked before, I just noticed in passing, she's somebody who, like many suffragettes, have been underestimated and not talked about in ways that either we remember them or in ways that are, in fact, sometimes vicious and even cruel in that way. For example, Muriel's life and her work began to be better known in Australia probably only about 15, 20 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, but not much beyond that. And in Adelaide, there's now something called a Muriel Matters Society, which is, but I think it's sort of something that is, that there's still an underappreciation of her in Australia as well as elsewhere. People in Australia don't quite know what to make of her, because they'll say, for example, to me, well, women had the vote by that time, so what was the big deal? And I'm kind of, well, they weren't only concerned about the vote. Vida Goldstein, for example, who I just mentioned, spent a lot of her time going around to different courts in Australia, for example, and saying to them and taking notes on sexual abuse of children trials. So she was very concerned with the sexual abuse of children, or the abuse of children more generally. Also, as was Muriel, who was big on the proper upbringing of children. And I'll just finish on that when I get to it. But if you look at here are two reviewers. Here are two remarks about Muriel. First is from a reviewer of one of the books on her. He says, he was a he says, for all her fame and exploits, stunts, Muriel Matters died a childless widow without a will, alone in a nursing home. She did no such thing, but even if she did, what a thing to say about somebody, as if they were a failure because they were childless. Anyway. Or Elizabeth Crawford, who writes some wonderful books on suffragettes, talking about why she preferred Muriel Matters to Emily Davison, for example, who died. And she said, Elizabeth Crawford said, martyrdom is not, and she's talking about Emily Davison here, martyrdom is not the only way by which to measure these campaigning women. Muriel Matters, she said, I find rather more appealing. You don't have to die. Well, yes, that's true. There was Muriel doing her stunts, but in a more light-hearted way. Muriel didn't do them in a light-hearted way. She did them with joy, but it wasn't a light-hearted in that sense. So I think we often misunderstand or misvalue the suffragettes for all that they did, and we're not always aware of, and certainly we're not aware that we can learn something from them. To everybody, just to remind you, those two remarks are some things that I would never write. And if I did write them, I hope I would attract a lot of criticism from people, from my friends and radical feminists. The thing that I wanted to finish off with was Muriel also had a very profound commitment to questions about ending war and the ending of the militarized society. In this was part of the differences and the disputes between the Women's Freedom League and the Women's Social and Political Union. Sorry, I just got distracted for a second. And during the war, the Women's Social and Political Union gave up their political campaigning and supported the war. In other words, they gave up their violent tactics, often violent tactics, and I don't say that as a criticism in any way. Whereas the Women's Freedom League, which had never practiced or advocated or supported violent tactics, for example, smashing windows or whipping Churchill or Asquith, for example, as they came off a train in those ways. But the Women's Freedom League did not support the war, and throughout the First World War, they remained adamantly opposed to it. So when Muriel, for example, came to, and she wrote about this more often than just this one address, but I'm going to just focus on that. When Muriel came to talk about the position of suffragettes in the war, she gave a speech, an address called The False Mysticism of War in 1915. She'd given versions of this or parts of this also in Australia before this, but this was given in England to a Quaker meeting. She said, and just to explain what she's talking about here, she said, in the case of war, I use the term not as applicable to any particular system, but to the pernicious, although vague, mass of talk, the outcome of many different modes of thought and sentiment in which we indulge. The vague feeling that we have that war has some hidden meaning based upon some spiritual truth, that war is an expression of some inner, inevitable divine need. In order to kind of fill that out, Muriel then charts the basis of the false mysticism of war in the uneven development of thoughts about ideas about war in the Catholic Church and its thinkers, and the transformation of the character of Jesus of Nazareth, for example, to one of the Prince of War, the acceptance of war and the glorification of war by churches. And along with that, she says it's also there was a development of the idea that those who will not fight are effeminate weaklings and cowards. Some may be, she says, but those of us who refuse to fight by the sword must show that we possess courage to be used on a plane which would be more effective than warfare on the physical plane. It's a very stirring, I imagine what it must have been to listen to her speak that. Some may be, but those of us who refuse to fight by the sword must show that we possess courage. What she then tackles is the question of the inevitability of war. And I feel like I have a real kind of, duty at this time yesterday, the last 2 or 3 years, duty of the time, a duty to talk about the roots of war and the foundations of war. And I think even when those of us who refuse to fight by the sword and those of us who are opposed to the use of military force often, and this is not my point, this is Muriel's point, often we think we'll never get rid of it. War will always be with us. And sometimes we add the phrase, human nature being what it is. This is Muriel's answer here. She says, we're tired of the phrase, human nature being what it is. Whatever else it may be, human nature is not static, it's dynamic. If the world is being rid of slavery, and she adds very perceptively, I think, if the world is being rid of slavery in its most obvious forms, at any rate, if it's being rid of the plague of dueling and other evils, all at one time considered inevitable and part of God's divine purpose, why can't we rid the earth of this hellish war? For war is hell. The sterner militarists who are devoid of sticky sentimentality have always told us that war is hell, and we know it. Then why entertain the idea? Why prepare for it? Why live in it? Why accept it? And she says, well, we just think we go around talking about it's inevitable, like we talk about the prostitution system as inevitable as well. Muriel's answer there is, she says, the word inevitable covers much mental laziness. In other words, when we say something is inevitable, even when we want it to disappear, we're being lazy. She says there's truth in the saying that it's easier to get men to fight than to think. And what she thinks of the military as a form of, as related to, is not just armaments and institutions and bands of armed men, for example, but she talks about it as a thought wave, the military as a form of civil thought. And by that, I don't mean that it's not material. She's referring to civil thought as a material reality that leads us to entertain the idea that war is inevitable, to prepare for it, even when we don't want to, and to live in it, that we think there is no other way. So whenever, and I'm just going to leave that there, but whenever we start to think of, the word inevitable comes to our mind to cover the things that we would like to abolish, like prostitution, like domestic violence, like other forms of violence against women and girls, like the militarization of society. Whenever we think of it in that way, just tell ourselves you're being lazy and you should snap out of it. And I've adapted this tactic often, and I even in my teaching, sometimes I say to students, when they say, "Barbara, it's inevitable. It's always been with us. It's the oldest profession." About prostitution, for example, I say, "Inevitable equals lazy." Talking about inevitable equals lazy. One of the most poignant things that, and I'm just going to use about another 5 minutes, if that's okay. One of the most poignant things that Muriel talks about in this regard is the education of children, and how children are educated to organize themselves in terms of a militarized society. For example, she talks about our streets and nurseries are full of the emblems of war. We have poems and storybooks full of military exploits in which killers are heroes. Sometimes they're sad heroes. Oh, I don't want to kill, but I have to. Sometimes they're sad heroes, but other times, we talk about the heroes of, most of the ancient heroes are military men who murder others. She says our music is often a form of dancing to war. And she talks about the way that even music has become subordinated to military imperatives. I think here that what she begins to take the measure of is something that I've become persuaded of quite recently, that although militarization and armies and war, the murder of war, for example, are connected to, and they are very tightly connected with other forms of male violence against women and children in particular, but other forms of male violence against themselves as well, is that even though they're connected, they are to some extent separate, and that there would be some benefit, even if we weren't able to end all forms of violence against women straight away, there would be some benefit in demilitarization of our society, in disarmament and in demilitarization as well, and particularly in demilitarizing the lives of children. That demilitarization has all sorts of costs. It costs us in trees, it costs us in environment. Militarization costs us in trees and environment. Militarization costs us in terms of lost benefits through the cost of getting ready for war, and also costs us in terms of the environmental destruction of the conduct of war. Not only the environmental destruction caused by the conduct of war, but of tests preparatory to war. Think of all the things that go into that. It was notorious in terms of music. It was notorious in America that more money was spent on military bands than on the entire budget for the National Endowment for the Humanities, up until quite recently. That even military bands got more than the arts or normal music. That all things work towards the glorification of murder. And Muriel reminds us, she says, there is no path to spiritual heights through murder. You can't attain nobility of soul or the good life through murder. I know there's always the questions that we ask about, what will you do if you're attacked? Can you defend yourself, and so forth? And I'm going to have to leave those questions. They're good questions, but I don't want to do them. But one thing that I want to remind you in ending is that and I'll just go to the next slide. This is a picture of young boys conducting themselves on the streets of London during the World War One. Oh, sorry, that's a group of feminists there. They're in their dressed up clothes. They've all got weapons of some sort. When they don't have weapons, they use their hands in the shape of a gun. They announce when they're killing somebody, they say, bang, bang, you're dead. And the other little boy says, no, I'm not dead. You didn't kill me. You didn't kill me. And he says, no, I decide who's dead in that way. They have a very fully worked out ritual of militarized murder that they practice. But we think it's innocent, or we tend to think it's innocent. We say, aren't those boys cute in their games and the militarization? And Muriel Matters points out that this is part of getting our society into a state where it is a glorious thing to kill. And I think boys might not so much anymore play those games and militarize their games. For example, when they pull on ropes, they call it a tug of war, or they use military terms for the types of games they play. But lastly, if you look at the last slide, this is a picture of a video game. And this is a picture of what boys and some girls play every day, are absorbed by, are consumed by, and I mean by are consumed by quite literally. In some cases, they're consumed by the games that they play, and they're dragged into the system in that way. So when we might say, well, we can't learn much from these old suffragettes, think about what we actually might be able to learn and to understand about the destruction and the harms of, for example, video games, even those without explicit sexual violence, which I know is very few of them left that don't have that, but this kind of war gaming that we play, and to think of the costs of that in terms of how it makes it very difficult to think of war, to think for boys in particular, boys and men, to think of war as anything other than inevitable and as something glorious. So that's just one thing that I'd like to take away from, or I'd like to give you and to be taken away about Muriel, her very early insight into the problems of militarization of a society. Thank you very much for having me, and I hope that there's a lot there that we could talk about.
Brilliant. So I've just spotlit me by mistake. So Marion, if you put your video on as well, we can get you in this conversation. Well, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Helen. That was really, really interesting and also inspiring. I mean, I've never heard of her, and I just Googled her, and it turns out that Muriel, spent 25 years in Penn, Penn, which is about 7 miles away from me, really quite easy to access. And they've
Joe,
got, yeah, oh, brilliant.
turn my video on. I
Oh,
can't turn it
yes.
on.
Yeah. So they have got a museum to her, and they're really positive. You know, they're really um uh saying how great she was. So I'll definitely go and visit there. And it also says that she went there. And there were loads of other suffragettes there. So it was a little hotbed of suffragettes, just about 7 miles away. So I'm definitely going to go and do a little suffragette investigation and go to see them. But right, so one thing I've got as a question is, where are her books or writings available? Because some of it sounds amazing. It would be lovely to read.
Um, the best way the easiest access is these two books that have been written on Muriel. And I don't think one of them is by Colette Snowden. That's a more recent one. And the other one is by, I think his name's Wakely. Sorry, I've just forgotten him for the second. But also the Muriel Matters Society. The other way is a bit more difficult, and I was thinking partly too when I was doing this talk of how good it would be to be able to put the speeches together, or,
Mm.
to find as many as we could. And that involves generally sort of consulting newspaper databases. And in Australia, there's a newspaper database called Trove, and it's really a gift to anybody doing research in just about any area of Australian sort of social, cultural, economic, political life. And there's Muriel came back to Australia several times and, would give talks here. So they were often reported in full, or, and there's some of them, like the False Mysticism of War was published separately. I have a copy of that, but it can be a little bit harder. And that just reminds me of, that we should do something about that.
Brilliant. Well, it's in Amersham Museum. The There's a Muriel Matters. There's a special, a huge amount about her, and one of them at this museum has called Alison Bailey. She's written a thing on their website, saying a daredevil suffragette and born agitator. So given that they're quite close to me, I might go and ask or email this Alison Bailey if she has access to some of the records, or if anybody has done that work. Because if
Mm,
somebody's brought the you never know, do you? But that I think that would be amazing
mm,
if we found that, and then those two
mm.
books sound really good as well.
Yeah,
Um,
they're a little bit, they're not quite, well, they're not what I would have written, let me put it that way, but they're good.
yeah,
They're a good introduction. Mm,
yeah, great. Okay. I've got another question. Well, the thing in here, it says that she came to London. She had been a very successful theatre performer,
mm,
acting on the stage, performing recitals, so she was great at that. Then she came to London. She attended meetings at Caxton Hall with Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst, but she joined a different union, not the WSPU. She joined Charlotte Despard's breakaway group, the Women's Freedom League, and their
yeah.
slogan was "Dare to be free." So what was that? What were the differences, and how did that go? Her being in not the main one.
Well, uh, um, as I mentioned, my great grandmother was in the Women's Freedom League and not in the Women's Social and Political Union. And often they are presented as kind of at odds with each other, but I don't think that that's as much the case as it's presented. But I can't produce a detailed argument to say that, but I don't think that there was that. They did have different aims, and in particular, the main kind of thing dividing them, as far in my view, and I could change this, and I'd be happy to change it. If there was other evidence, but the main thing seems to be their opinion of violent tactics, of what were called violent tactics. So the Women's Freedom League did not take part in campaigns or as an organisation, it didn't take part. I should be careful about that, because I think some of its members didn't follow the didn't follow the guidelines of the Freedom League as strictly as others did. But I think that they the window smashing, they were opposed to, the blowing up of mailboxes, opposed to also that kind of, most of the violence of the women's social and the WSPU was purposely directed at property, not at persons. But there was and that could be very upsetting and disturbing too, like the destruction, the attack on the paintings, which was reaching its height around 1912, 1913, just as the war broke out. And, paintings that women thought were um, objectionable in some way, different ways. They would, sometimes it was just because it was a painting of a man whom they disagreed with strongly, who denied them votes, or other times it was a picture of the reclining Venus, which was attacked by a woman. And she said the scars on the painting made it a better painting because it was more in line with justice. I've got a lot of sympathy with that. And, um, I think, I don't know, I think that was considered a big a big difference between them.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not sure that it meant that they could never work together. I don't think it meant that. It just meant that that was, different organisations had different views, and I'm sure that women themselves cross the lines quite frequently.
Yeah. I mean, at the moment with Women's Declaration International, we
Mm,
are more radical feminists.
mm,
We've always taken a harder line on this, whether you can change sex, sort of been quite strong on it. But we
mm,
have really good ties with lots of other groups, and also we're women only. So uh, the LGB Alliance have lots of men in them. Women's Rights Network are much more sort of gentle about things, but it, we work really closely with them. Um,
yeah,
and
yeah.
I guess that's similar that I would read it like that they were working together, but they had a few different things. And then, some people were saying that they're a bit dictatorial, the Pankhursts, particularly Emmeline.
Mm. And
Yeah, Marion, what do you think?
I think, and I'm looking in the chat as well, that people will say, well, one side is the same as the other, or both sides. And somebody said, I don't like people being, aggressive with me or potentially violent, and I don't. But if a woman is being assaulted or about to be raped, I want her to be so violent towards that man that he gives up and goes away, and she cuts off his dick, whatever she has to do to not be assaulted or raped. So it's kind of not both sides. And if women, if it takes women, um, and I'm not talking about whether or not it should have been a World War I or World War II, just talking about like personal responses for women to getting our rights, to getting what should be ours, that it's really okay to escalate strategically to get what we're due. So it's
Mm.
not really both sides are the same because they're not.
No.
But they're at different levels, aren't
Yes.
they? There's like a
Yep. Yep.
nation
Yep.
or an individual woman. But yeah, go back to Helen.
I was just going to say, I think that would be, I think we don't talk about violence enough, and we don't talk about righteous violence. One thing that Muriel sort of did teach me was that, you could, if we could, you don't have to get rid of it all at once, although that would be obviously great. But, we really need to demilitarize, to get weapons out of people's hands. And that will still leave them with their hands, and that will still leave them with their monstrous projects and stuff like that, and their attacks on women. But, it would be a massive kind of advance to end state military, the militarization of the state and of government in that way.
I'd like to
And
get weapons out of men's hands.
yeah, but
I
but
mean, I mean, if I had to do one thing, that would be like, to start.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah,
I've
but this is what I was just saying. Sorry, I think it'd be really
gone.
good for us to talk more about this question. Because I
Yeah.
think we often start talking about it, and then we have to finish. and
So
but
let's
an explicit discussion of of our violence in our tactics, and if, whether it becomes justified, and yeah.
I was the coordinator of a young women's feminist magazine in 1987 or something like that for about 3 years. It was called Shocking Pink, and we were all very young and radical, and we were somehow the Guardian newspaper got to the women's page of the Guardian newspaper got to hear about us, and they said, "Oh, you're wonderful! You're absolutely wonderful. We're going to do an article about how wonderful you are, sort of all this." Young women, blah blah blah. And so we went there. They interviewed us. They took really nice photos of us, and then they said, "Oh, just before we run this, can you just send us the lead pages or the pages to show you what your next issue is, what you're going to have in your." And we used to print 5,000 copies of these magazines and go around selling them, and we had done a picture. We had a picture of a woman in a Belgian strike in some sort of protest, throwing a cobblestone. It was an old woman throwing a cobblestone, and our title was "Violence by Women?" question mark. And so we were unpicking this. We were thinking, in what circumstances can women be violent? And we were thinking this is a really key issue. And the Guardian got back to us and said, "Oh, right. We don't like you talking about that. This is very not okay. We're not going to run your piece unless you change and you take out all of your stuff about violence by women." And of course, we didn't do that, so we didn't get in the Guardian and blah blah blah. But I thought that's really interesting that they actually did not want us to even discuss violence by women, that sometimes women need to be violent and obviously we're capable of it. And we might choose, as you know, you're saying, and Muriel was saying, to try to have a situation where there is much less violence and we demilitarize. But there might be some situations where violence by women, we just wanted to talk about it, but they actually wouldn't even let us do that. Well, they said they wouldn't publicize our magazine. So that was, but I think we should definitely do that. Let's do it.
Let's try and find also, maybe if we try and find some maybe like Valerie Solanas, for example, or something like that. I haven't read much Valerie Solanas, and I certainly haven't read much recently.
Yeah.
But just a woman talking about violence, which would give us a kind of
yeah.
Somebody comes up and
we've got
catches.
Valerie, but there's also Virginia Woolf, Three Guineas, which I think is probably the best book of all time. Three Guineas, she talks about it's about a man writing to her saying, "Hello, Virginia, what do women think? What do women think we should do about war to stop war?" And she answers it, and I mean, it's just mind-blowingly useful. So that could be part of it. We could have a bit of what she's saying, a bit of what Muriel's saying, bit of what Marion's saying, and and yeah, as you say, Valerie Solanas, who had this visceral anger, which speaks to so many women. Like we've had a previous RFP on it, but if we really focus on violence, that could be quite useful.
I kind of think, Simone and I often talk about too it's a great story, I think, of Andrea Dawkins was at I think it was a circumcision, which is interesting context for it, circumcision party for a young boy, or maybe it was a bar mitzvah, I don't know. Anyway, and Allen Ginsberg was there, and he said, "Oh, hello, Andrea, how are you?" And she just sort of turned her back on him or something. I forget the exact story, but it's written down somewhere. And then he said, "You really don't like me." And Ginsberg had a record of defending child abuse, and I think of practicing it too, but I'm not quite sure of that. But certainly of defending it, must have been practicing too. And Andrea Dawkins said to him, I just can't stand you, and he started shouting at the party, around saying, "Andrea, I hope I'm getting this right, but might be not quite right." He started saying, "Andrea would put me in prison, Andrea would put me in prison," and as if that was a terrible loss to the world of, Ginsberg going to prison. And she simply stated to him, "No, Alan, no, I would shoot you dead. I don't want you to go to prison." And at this present stage, not only if there was somebody talking in the chat about this present stage of the bombings going on as we speak, etc., but also, that we really need to come to terms with child abuse and to understand it as foundational of sovereignty, of government, of politics, and to not just think of it as something bad that happens, which it is. Of course, I'm not defending it, obviously, but, of understanding how, and exemplified by Epstein, among others, how it really is fundamental to how we organize our lives.
Brilliant.
Not just anyway. So
yeah,
we could put and maybe Andrea has might have written something, especially on violence too. So that'd be
Yeah.
good.
Great. And we've got the very good suggestion from Lucy in the chat saying there's Harriet Wistrish has done a very good book, Sister-in-Law, which that might be very interesting for us to sort of talk about. I'm going to write that down.
And Jocelyn talks about the women's response to violence against them as well at length. So that
Yeah.
Jocelyn Scott, who's in the chat.
Yes, who's here? Yeah, brilliant. And Jocelyn said that she will do the Muriel's wedding talk. Um, fantastic. Okay, look, we're gonna have to stop. It's very bad. We're 2 minutes over time. We've done a
Okay.
Uh-oh.
disaster, a timing disaster. Thank you
Everybody,
very much.
thank you so much for having me. Again, it's so lovely to speak to and to be amongst such good friends.
Brilliant. Thank you. It was brilliant. Lovely. Okay, bye everybody.
Bye-bye.